The glass towers of Manhattan reflected nothing but success that morning, and CEO Evelyn Carter had built an empire on instinct, on reading people in seconds, on knowing exactly who deserved her attention. So when a man approached her with an extended hand, she refused to shake it, dismissed him in front of dozens of witnesses, and walked away feeling completely justified. What Evelyn didn't know was that the quiet man she had just humiliated controlled the very foundations her company was built on. And by the next morning, everything she thought was guaranteed would begin to disappear. Today, Evelyn Carter was about to learn what happens when the hand you refuse to shake is the one holding up your entire world. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun reflected off the glass towers of Manhattan, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floors of Meridian Technologies headquarters. Inside the sprawling atrium, the air buzzed with carefully orchestrated energy. This wasn't just another corporate event. This was theater. Innovation Demo Day. The phrase appeared on sleek digital displays throughout the building, accompanied by the company logo that had become synonymous with cutting-edge success. Media representatives adjusted their cameras, while junior partners clutched tablets, rehearsing talking points they'd memorized the night before. Board members congregated near the refreshment tables, their practiced smiles masking the constant calculation happening behind their eyes. Potential investors moved through the space like sharks circling prey, polite but predatory. This gathering had been planned for months. Every detail mattered. The lighting, the catering, the guest list, even the temperature of the room had been debated in committee meetings. Meridian Technologies was announcing its next era, and every person in that atrium had been carefully selected to witness it. The company's public relations team had worked overtime to ensure the right mix of influential voices, deep pockets, and media coverage. Nothing was left to chance. Evelyn Carter stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, surveying her domain with the satisfaction of someone who had built an empire through sheer will and strategic ruthlessness. At 48, she had become one of the most recognized CEOs in the tech industry. Her reputation preceded her in every boardroom, every negotiation, every market analysis. Impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, she embodied the kind of polished perfection that graced magazine covers and keynote stages. But those who worked closely with Evelyn knew the truth behind the glossy exterior. She was brilliant, undeniably so. Her strategic mind could dissect complex problems in minutes and identify solutions that others missed entirely. However, that brilliance came with a price. She was known for brutal efficiency, for cutting through sentimentality and emotion to reach what she called the core truth of any situation. Her leadership style had been described in various ways over the years. Admirers called her decisive and visionary. Critics used different words. Cold, calculating, elitist. Evelyn prided herself on reading people instantly. She believed she could assess someone's value, their potential, their worth within seconds of meeting them. It was a skill she'd honed over decades in cutthroat corporate environments, and it had served her well. Or so she thought. What she didn't recognize, what she'd never allowed herself to examine too closely, was how that supposed skill had quietly transformed into something darker. Unchecked bias disguised as intuition. Prejudice wrapped in the language of professionalism. The presentation had gone flawlessly. Meridian's latest innovations had been unveiled with the perfect blend of technical detail and aspirational rhetoric. The audience had responded exactly as planned, with the right mixture of enthusiasm and serious contemplation. Now came the crucial part, the mingling, the networking, the delicate dance of power and influence that happened in the spaces between formal presentations. Among the crowd, a man moved with quiet confidence. Malcolm Reed had arrived without the usual entourage that accompanied people of significant wealth and influence. No assistants trailing behind him, no publicist managing his image, no security team creating a buffer between him and the world. He simply walked through the door, signed in at the guest registry, and entered the atrium like any other attendee. Malcolm was 42, though he carried himself with the assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. Sharply dressed in a navy suit that fit perfectly without being ostentatious, he had the kind of presence that should have commanded attention. But in rooms like this, where assumptions ran deep and biases lurked beneath polished surfaces, his presence was often misread or ignored entirely. Several staff members gave him uncertain glances. A junior associate assumed he was a consultant and tried to direct him toward the vendor registration table. Another mistook him for someone's plus one and asked which executive he was accompanying. Malcolm noticed every instance, registered every assumption, but his expression remained neutral. He learned long ago that correcting people's misconceptions in moments like these rarely changed anything meaningful. Better to observe, to understand who revealed themselves through their assumptions. He made his way through the crowd with purpose, listening to conversations, watching the dynamics of power play out in real time. This wasn't his first corporate event, and the patterns were familiar. The hierarchy was visible in every interaction. Who spoke first, who interrupted whom, whose jokes got laughs regardless of whether they were funny, whose presence made others straighten their posture. As the formal presentation concluded and people dispersed into smaller clusters, Malcolm approached Evelyn. She was holding court near the windows, surrounded by board members and senior executives who hung on her every word. He waited patiently for a natural break in the conversation, then stepped forward with professional courtesy. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Malcolm Reed, I appreciate the opportunity to attend today's presentation. Impressive work." He extended his hand in a universal gesture of professional greeting. It was automatic, almost reflexive, the social contract that governed business interactions across industries and continents. A handshake. Simple, expected, unremarkable. Evelyn turned toward him. Her eyes swept over him quickly. That supposedly infallible assessment she prided herself on. In less than 2 seconds, she had categorized him, dismissed him, and decided he wasn't worth her time. She looked at his extended hand as if it were something vaguely distasteful, like a piece of litter someone had thoughtlessly placed in her path. The pause stretched. 1 second. 2. Long enough for the people nearby to notice. Long enough for the moment to take on weight. Then Evelyn smiled. It was thin, tight, the kind of smile that had no warmth behind it. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the immediate area, loud enough for at least a dozen people to hear every word. "I don't shake hands with people outside my circle." She folded her arms across her chest, a physical barrier reinforcing her verbal rejection. Then she turned away, dismissing Malcolm as completely as if he had simply ceased to exist. She resumed her conversation with a board member about quarterly projections, her tone easy and conversational, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. The ripple effect was immediate. Conversations nearby stuttered and died. Several people looked down at their drinks or suddenly became fascinated with their phones. A nervous laugh came from somewhere to the left, quickly stifled. The junior vice president, who had been standing closest to the interaction, started to move forward, his face showing clear discomfort, but stopped abruptly when Evelyn's gaze flicked toward him with unmistakable warning. He stepped back, looking everywhere except at Malcolm. Among the witnesses were people who would remember this moment for very different reasons. Daniel Brooks, a mid-level executive who had been with Meridian for 6 years, stood frozen near the refreshment table. His face had gone pale because, unlike most people in that room, he recognized Malcolm Reed. He'd seen that face in the financial press, in industry publications, at high-level conferences. His mind was already racing through implications, calculating consequences that Evelyn clearly hadn't considered. Lena Cho, head of legal, had been reviewing notes on her tablet when the interaction happened. She looked up just in time to catch the tail end of the exchange. Her stomach dropped. Years of legal training and corporate damage control had honed her instincts, and every one of them was now screaming that something very bad had just occurred. She made a mental note to pull Malcolm's background immediately after the event concluded. Rachel Moore, the PR director whose job was to manage Meridian's public image, felt the blood drain from her face. She'd been watching the room carefully, as she always did during public events, alert for anything that might create problems. She'd seen the entire interaction. Her mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Who else had seen it? Were any media representatives close enough to witness the exchange? Was anyone filming? In an age where everyone carried a camera in their pocket, any moment could become viral content. Malcolm stood there for a heartbeat longer, his hand still extended in empty air. Then slowly, with no hint of anger or embarrassment, he lowered it. His expression remained completely neutral, professional, almost serene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He simply looked at Evelyn's back for a moment, then spoke clearly. Understood. I'll remember that. For words. Quiet. Almost gentle. But anyone paying attention would have heard something in his tone that should have given Evelyn pause. Not a threat. Not anger. Something more dangerous than either. A promise. Malcolm turned and walked toward the exit. His pace was unhurried, his posture relaxed. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam doors. He simply left, moving through the atrium with the same quiet confidence he'd shown when he arrived. The crowd parted for him automatically, people stepping aside without quite knowing why, responding to something in his presence that demanded respect even if they hadn't consciously recognized it. The atrium slowly returned to life as conversations resumed, though the energy had shifted. Something had changed in the room's atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there before. Most people quickly moved on, relegating the incident to the category of minor social awkwardness. But a few, Daniel Brooks, Lena Cho, and Rachel Moore among them, couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just witnessed something significant. Later that evening, Evelyn sat in her corner office, the city lights spread out below her like a constellation of power and possibility. Her assistant had left for the day. The building was quiet. She poured herself a glass of scotch and reflected on the event with satisfaction. The presentation had been perfect. The response from legitimate investors had been enthusiastic. Everything had gone according to plan. When her chief of staff had tentatively mentioned the incident with Malcolm Reed, asking if perhaps they should follow up, Evelyn had waved him off impatiently. She dismissed the entire interaction as optics management, a phrase she used often to justify decisions that others found questionable. In her mind, Malcolm had been trying to attach himself to her success, to gain credibility through association with her and her company. She'd simply maintained appropriate boundaries. Her advisors had seemed uneasy, but she'd shut down their concerns with her usual efficiency. They worked for her. They executed her vision. Second-guessing her judgment wasn't part of their job description. If they couldn't understand the necessity of maintaining standards and protecting the company's reputation, then perhaps they weren't the right people for their positions. What Evelyn didn't know, couldn't have known from her position of assumed superiority, was that while she was congratulating herself on maintaining boundaries, a 12-second video clip was beginning to circulate online. Someone in that atrium had been filming on their phone, capturing the moment for whatever reason. The footage wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No confrontation. Just Evelyn refusing Malcolm's handshake, her voice clear and cutting, followed by Malcolm's calm departure. The person who posted it didn't add commentary. It didn't need to. The clip spoke for itself. It started in a small corner of social media, shared initially among people who worked in finance and tech. No major news outlets picked it up. No hashtag campaña emerged. It simply moved through professional networks like water, finding cracks in concrete, quiet but persistent. That same night, while Evelyn slept soundly in her Upper East Side penthouse, Malcolm Reed sat in his Tribeca office with his core team. The space was elegant but understated, the kind of environment that spoke of real wealth rather than the need to display it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on economics, philosophy, and history. Abstract art pieces chosen for meaning rather than investment value decorated the space. His team consisted of 3 people he'd worked with for years. They knew Malcolm's history, understood his methods, and more importantly, shared his values. As they reviewed the day's events, one of his advisors brought up the incident at Meridian. "Are we moving forward?" she asked. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city lights. When he spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. "We're not pulling anything. We're simply not extending what wasn't requested." His team nodded. They understood the distinction. Malcolm Reed wasn't in the business of revenge. He didn't sabotage companies or destroy careers out of spite. But he also didn't waste his resources on people or organizations that demonstrated certain values, or lack thereof. What Evelyn Carter didn't know, what she would discover far too late, was that Malcolm Reed wasn't at that event seeking investment opportunities. He was already invested in Meridian Technologies. Not directly, not in ways that appeared on standard investor reports, but through a complex network of consortium funds, infrastructure partnerships, and regulatory relationships. Malcolm controlled access to resources that Meridian desperately needed. Resources they didn't even know were about to become unavailable. Malcolm had built his influence over 2 decades, not through aggressive acquisition or hostile takeovers, but through strategic patience and genuine relationship building. He invested in people as much as companies. He supported initiatives that others overlooked. He opened doors that had been closed to him and used that access to create pathways for others. His network was vast, interconnected, and most importantly, built on trust and mutual respect. Now, as he sat in his office considering the day's events, Malcolm wasn't making calls or issuing directives. He was simply deciding what he wouldn't do, which partnerships he wouldn't renew, which introductions he wouldn't make, which endorsements he would quietly withdraw. In the world of high-level finance and corporate infrastructure, sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones that looked like nothing at all. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Manhattan feel almost manageable. Evelyn's alarm went off at 5:30, as it did every morning. She followed her usual routine: exercise, shower, coffee, news briefing prepared by her assistant. By the time she left her penthouse at 7:15, she'd already responded to 30 emails and reviewed preliminary reports from 3 departments. Her phone showed several missed calls from the previous evening, but that wasn't unusual. Being CEO of a major tech company meant constant communication, endless demands on her attention. She assumed they were routine matters that her team had already handled or could be addressed during her morning briefing. She walked into Meridian's headquarters with her usual confidence, her heels clicking against marble floors with the rhythm of someone who owned every space she entered. But something felt different. The lobby staff's greetings seemed slightly off, their smiles a fraction too tight. Her assistant met her at the elevator with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. When the doors opened on the executive floor, she noticed people quickly looking away, conversations pausing mid-sentence as she passed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Evelyn had spent her career reading rooms and understanding power dynamics. Something was wrong. She walked into her office and found her chief operating officer, Richard Donovan, already waiting. He was a man who had mastered the art of delivering bad news with a calm exterior, but this morning, even his considerable composure showed cracks. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. Evelyn set down her bag, her expression sharpening. "Define situation." Richard pulled up information on his tablet and turned it toward her. "The Silverton Consortium. They've paused indefinitely." Evelyn felt a flicker of concern, but kept her voice level. "Paused what exactly?" "Everything. The funding pipeline we've been building for the overseas expansion. It was supposed to finalize this week. Now, they're saying they need to reassess their priorities." Richard's jaw tightened. "Evelyn, this was guaranteed. We had signed letters of intent. This shouldn't be possible." "There's always a reason," Evelyn said, though her mind was already racing. "What are they saying officially?" "That's the problem. They're not saying anything. No explanation. No timeline for reconsideration. Just silence." Before Evelyn could respond, her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Another break from normal protocol that heightened Evelyn's sense that control was slipping. "Lena needs to see you immediately. She says it's urgent." Lena Cho entered moments later, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained alarm. She held her own tablet like a shield. "We have a regulatory problem. The infrastructure approval from the Department of Commerce, the one that's been pending for 18 months, It's been reopened for review. Evelyn stared at her. That's impossible. We cleared every hurdle. The approval was effectively finalized. They were just running out the procedural clock. I know, Lena said quietly. This doesn't happen. Not at this stage. Not without significant cause. I've reached out to our contacts at Commerce, and everyone is suddenly unavailable. No one will take my calls. Richard and Lena exchanged glances. The same thought was clearly occurring to both of them, but neither wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Finally, Lena spoke carefully. Evelyn, I need to ask you something. Yesterday, at the demo event, the man you refused to shake hands with, did you know who he was? Some consultant trying to network above his station. Evelyn said dismissively, though something in Lena's expression made her uncertain. Why? That was Malcolm Reed, Lena said quietly. The name meant nothing to Evelyn. She waited for more context, growing impatient when none came. And Malcolm Reed isn't a consultant, Daniel Brooks said from the doorway. No one had noticed him arrive. His presence was unexpected, a mid-level executive interrupting a senior leadership discussion. But the gravity of the situation had apparently dissolved normal hierarchies. He's a principal investor controlling multiple consortium funds. He has deep ties across regulatory bodies, vendor networks, infrastructure partnerships throughout the industry. Evelyn, he's not just connected. He's the connection between dozens of entities we depend on. The room went very quiet. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She'd built her career on not showing weakness, not allowing emotion to cloud judgment. One investor doesn't have that much influence. You're overreacting. Am I? Daniel moved further into the room, his voice respectful but firm. The Silverton Consortium has 5 major funds. Reed is a principal in 3 of them. The Commerce Department approval you mentioned? The review board includes 2 people who have worked directly with Reed on previous projects. He doesn't make threats. He doesn't have to. He just withdraws support, and things that seemed guaranteed suddenly become uncertain. Evelyn wanted to dismiss this, wanted to believe it was coincidence or exaggeration. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Less than 24 hours after the handshake incident, critical partnerships were dissolving like morning fog. She thought about Malcolm's calm departure, those 4 quiet words. Understood. I'll remember that. Not a threat. A statement of fact. Find out what he wants, Evelyn said finally. There's always a negotiation point. Everyone has leverage they're willing to trade. But over the following hours, every attempt to gather information hit walls. Malcolm Reed wasn't making demands. He wasn't issuing statements. He wasn't doing anything that could be pointed to as hostile action. From his perspective, from what Evelyn's team could piece together, he was simply conducting business as usual. Routine decisions about where to allocate resources and attention. The problem was that every one of those routine decisions somehow removed support from Meridian Technologies. A vendor relationship that had been solid for 5 years suddenly needed to renegotiate terms. A partnership that was supposed to expand instead quietly scaled back. None of it was dramatic. None of it was actionable. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, each one defensible on its own, but collectively devastating. Rachel Moore appeared in Evelyn's office late morning with news that made everything worse. Finance blogs are picking up the story. They're not accusing anyone of anything specific, but the headlines are pointed. She pulled up several articles on her phone. Elite CEO's cold shoulder. What really happened at Meridian's demo day? When power meets power. The handshake, that didn't happen. Investor Malcolm Reed quickly exits Meridian orbit. The articles didn't need to spell out implications. The finance community could read between the lines. The 12-second video clip was now circulating more widely, no longer confined to small professional networks. Business school professors were already using it as a teaching moment about unconscious bias and professional conduct. The comment sections were brutal. By afternoon, 2 board members had requested an emergency briefing. The stock hadn't dropped yet. Market confidence was a slow-moving beast, resistant to rumors and speculation. But the tremors were there, subtle shifts that people who understood corporate ecosystems could feel. The board wanted to know what Evelyn planned to do about it. That's when Evelyn realized how little power she actually had in this situation. She couldn't force Malcolm to take her calls. She couldn't compel him to restore relationships he'd chosen to withdraw. She couldn't threaten him with anything that mattered. For the first time in her career, she was facing consequences that her position and reputation couldn't shield her from. Against every instinct, against the pride that had defined her leadership style, Evelyn asked her assistant to reach out to Malcolm Reed's office. Not a demand for a meeting, just a quiet inquiry about whether he might be open to a conversation. Professional, respectful, the kind of outreach that acknowledged his position rather than assuming her own supremacy. The response came back within minutes. Her assistant's face said everything before the words even came out. Mr. Reed has no meeting availability. Simple. Final. The same kind of dismissal Evelyn had shown him, returned with equal clarity. That evening, Lena returned to Evelyn's office with the worst news yet. She closed the door behind her and sat down without being invited. Another small signal that normal protocols had dissolved. I've been going through our contractual obligations. If the funding freeze continues for 72 more hours, we violate key milestones in our expansion agreements. That triggers penalty clauses, significant ones, and it gives the board legal grounds to initiate a leadership review. Evelyn had been staring out her window at the city, but now she turned slowly. A leadership review. Your leadership, Lena clarified quietly. Evelyn, I need you to understand the position we're in. This isn't about bad publicity or awkward optics anymore. This is about structural damage to the company. If we can't stabilize this situation immediately, your position as CEO becomes questionable. Not because of the handshake itself, but because of the fallout you didn't anticipate and can't seem to control. For the first time since this began, Evelyn felt genuine fear. Not concern, not worry. Fear. She had built Meridian into what it was. She had made decisions that others thought impossible. She had sacrificed relationships, personal time, every aspect of normal life to reach this position. And now was threatening to collapse because of one moment, one decision, one refusal to extend basic professional courtesy. She thought about Malcolm Reed's face, the calm neutrality of his expression. She replayed the moment in her mind, seeing it differently now. What had seemed like appropriate boundary setting yesterday now looked like exactly what it was, a public humiliation based on assumptions and biases she'd never bothered to examine. The office was quiet except for the muted sounds of the city 40 floors below. Lena stood to leave, but paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think he's enjoying this. Everything I've learned about Malcolm Reed suggests he doesn't operate from spite, but he also doesn't forget disrespect. And right now, he's enforcing a boundary that you created. After Lena left, Evelyn sat alone in the growing darkness. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat there, watching the city transform as day became night, watching her reflection gradually appear in the glass, and wondering how everything had changed so completely in less than 48 hours. Her phone buzzed with another message from the board chair, another request for updates she didn't have. Evelyn looked at it and realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. This wasn't a negotiation she could win through strategy or leverage. This was about accountability for actions she'd dismissed as insignificant. And Malcolm Reed was teaching her a lesson she'd apparently needed to learn for years. The lesson was simple, devastating, and completely unavoidable. Power without respect is just waiting to collapse. And sometimes, the hand you refuse to shake is the one holding up your entire world. The 72 hours had begun counting down. Evelyn felt it like a timer, ticking in her chest, constant and unavoidable. The morning after Malcolm's refusal to meet, she walked into the executive conference room for the senior leadership briefing and immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. People were present, professional, going through the motions. But something fundamental had changed. No one made eye contact the way they used to. When she spoke, people nodded and took notes, but the automatic deference that had always characterized these meetings had evaporated. Marcus Webb, the chief technology officer who had always been quick to support her positions, now sat with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah Chun, head of operations, studied her coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions no one was asking out loud. The room no longer bent toward Evelyn's authority. It simply existed around her, polite but distant. She pushed through the meeting with her usual efficiency, outlining action items and demanding updates on damage control efforts. But when she finished speaking, the silence that followed felt different from the usual pause before people jumped to execute her directives. This silence had weight. It had judgment. Daniel Brooks cleared his throat. We should discuss the Reed situation directly. There is no Reed situation, Evelyn said sharply. There's a temporary misalignment of partnership priorities that we're addressing through standard channels. Evelyn, Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. Everyone in this room knows what happened. Everyone in the industry knows what happened. Pretending it's a routine business matter isn't helping. For a moment, Evelyn considered shutting him down the way she always did when executives questioned her framing of situations. But looking around the room, she saw the same thought reflected in every face. They were tired of the pretense. They were tired of managing optics for a crisis their CEO refused to acknowledge. She dismissed the meeting early. As people filed out, she caught fragments of whispered conversations that cut deeper than any open criticism could have. They weren't angry. They were disappointed. Worse, they were losing faith. Over the following days, Evelyn found herself doing something she rarely did. She researched Malcolm Reed's background, not through assistants or briefing documents, but directly. She read articles about his career trajectory, watched interviews he'd given to business publications, traced the pattern of his investments and partnerships. What emerged was a picture that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Malcolm Reed had built his influence through a very specific approach. He never publicly humiliated anyone. He never leveraged his position to destroy competitors or punish people who crossed him. Instead, he simply invested in relationships built on mutual respect and withdrew from situations where that respect was absent. He'd written in an essay once, published in a financial journal, about the economics of dignity. The core argument was simple but powerful. Systems built on exclusion eventually exclude themselves from opportunity. The essay included a personal section that Evelyn found herself reading multiple times. Malcolm described his early career, the countless times he'd been mistaken for service staff at corporate events, the meetings where his credentials were questioned despite being more qualified than anyone in the room, the subtle and not-so-subtle messages that he didn't belong in elite spaces. He didn't write about these experiences with anger or bitterness. He wrote about them as data points, evidence of a system that wasted talent and potential because of superficial judgments and ingrained biases. One passage stayed with Evelyn long after she closed her laptop. I learned that the most powerful response to disrespect isn't confrontation. It's absence. When you remove your presence, your resources, your endorsement from spaces that don't value you, you create a void. And sometimes that void teaches lessons that arguments never could. She was reading Malcolm's philosophy on what he was doing to her company, to her career, to her reputation. This wasn't revenge. This was a lesson, and she was failing it spectacularly. That evening, Evelyn made a decision she would have considered unthinkable a week ago. She reached out to a mutual contact, Gregory Hamilton, a venture capitalist who had worked with both Meridian and several of Malcolm's funds. She asked him to act as an intermediary, to open a line of communication that her own attempts had failed to establish. Gregory agreed, though his tone suggested he understood exactly how difficult this conversation would be. 2 days later, he called her back. "I spoke with Malcolm," Gregory said carefully. He was willing to listen. Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. And he declined, politely. He said if you couldn't speak to him when it was easy, you shouldn't feel obligated to now that it's hard. Gregory paused. "Evelyn, I've known Malcolm for 15 years. He's not playing games. He's not waiting for the right offer. He's genuinely uninterested in negotiating with you." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. Did he say what he wants? That's the thing. He doesn't want anything from you. He's just decided that doing business with Meridian, or more specifically with you leading Meridian, isn't aligned with his values. He's not trying to destroy your company. He's simply choosing not to support it. After Gregory hung up, Evelyn sat in her office, staring at nothing. The distinction he'd made was important. Malcolm wasn't attacking. He was withdrawing. And somehow, that was infinitely more devastating than any hostile action could have been. The internal dissent that had been brewing finally surfaced when Daniel Brooks requested a private meeting. Evelyn almost refused, not wanting to face another uncomfortable conversation, but something in his demeanor suggested this was important. They met in a small conference room, away from the glass-walled executive spaces where every interaction was visible to dozens of employees. Daniel sat across from her, and for a long moment, he just looked at her with an expression that combined frustration, disappointment, and something that might have been concern. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I've worked here for 6 years. I've defended your leadership style to people who called it harsh. I've explained away decisions that others found questionable. I believe that results mattered more than methods." He paused, choosing his words carefully. But what happened with Malcolm Reed wasn't about strategy or business judgment. It was personal, and that distinction matters. "Daniel, I don't need a lecture on." "Yes, you do," he interrupted, his voice still calm but unmovable. "You need to hear this because no one else is going to say it directly. You refused to shake that man's hand because you made assumptions about who he was based on how he looked. You categorized him, dismissed him, and humiliated him in front of dozens of people. And you did it so automatically that you didn't even realize what you were doing." Evelyn wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that it wasn't that simple. But the words died in her throat because somewhere deep down, she knew he was right. She replayed that moment again. Malcolm approaching professionally, his polite introduction, her instant assessment, the refusal. She felt so certain, so justified. But what had that certainty been based on? Not his credentials, not his reputation, not anything he'd actually said or done. Just assumptions, just bias. "The board is meeting tomorrow," Daniel continued. "They're going to review your leadership. If this situation isn't stabilized, they have grounds to remove you. Not because of bad publicity, because you've put the entire company at risk through a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with prejudice you won't acknowledge." He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who got comfortable with power and stopped questioning your own judgment. But intention doesn't erase impact. And right now, the impact of what you did is dismantling everything you've built." After Daniel left, Evelyn remained in the conference room long after she should have returned to her office. The building grew quiet as people left for the evening. Cleaning staff moved through the halls. The city lights outside transformed the windows into mirrors, and Evelyn found herself staring at her own reflection. For the first time in her career, real self-doubt crept in. Not the strategic second-guessing that came with difficult decisions, but fundamental questioning of who she was and how she'd gotten here. She'd always believed she was judging people on merit, on competence, on potential. But what if that belief had been self-deception? What if her supposedly infallible instinct was actually just a collection of biases she'd never bothered to examine? The board meeting the next day was brutal in its civility. No one raised their voices. No one made accusations. They simply presented facts. The funding pipeline was still frozen. Regulatory approvals remained in limbo. Partnership agreements were deteriorating. Stock prices were beginning to show strain as market analysts published increasingly pointed questions about Meridian's leadership stability. The board chair, Patricia Winters, a woman in her 60s who had been a mentor to Evelyn early in her career, spoke with painful honesty. "The question before us isn't whether you made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you have the capacity to acknowledge it, learn from it, and rebuild the trust that's been damaged. So far, we haven't seen evidence of that capacity." Evelyn wanted to defend herself, to explain, to strategize her way out of this crisis the way she'd navigated every other challenge in her career. But looking around the table at faces that had once shown unwavering support, she realized that strategy wasn't the answer. The problem wasn't external. It was internal. and no amount of clever maneuvering would fix what was fundamentally broken. That night, alone in her office late enough that even the cleaning staff had finished and left, Evelyn did something she hadn't done in years. She allowed herself to be genuinely afraid, not of losing her job, though that fear was real, but of the possibility that Daniel was right, that she'd become someone who wielded power without wisdom, who made judgments without examination, who dismissed people based on prejudices she convinced herself were insights. She thought about Malcolm Reed's calm face, the professionalism of his approach, the dignity of his departure. He hadn't needed to destroy her. He'd simply shown her what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged as less than, to have your worth determined by someone else's biases. And the lesson was devastating precisely because it was so measured, so controlled, so thoroughly deserved. Evelyn opened her laptop. She didn't call her PR team. She didn't consult with legal. She didn't strategize with advisors. She simply wrote an email. Direct, unpolished, honest in a way that felt terrifying and necessary. Mr. Reed, I was wrong. What I did at the demo event was disrespectful, unprofessional, and based on assumptions I should never have made. I would like to speak with you face to face, not to negotiate or defend myself, but to apologize properly and take responsibility for my actions. I understand if you decline this request. I've given you no reason to grant me this courtesy, but I'm asking anyway. She read it 3 times. Each time, she was tempted to revise it, to make it more polished, more strategic. But finally, she just sent it, raw and simple and true. The response came the next morning. One sentence that contained no warmth, but also no cruelty. Tomorrow, 15 minutes. Evelyn spent the next 24 hours in a state she barely recognized. Preparation without the usual tools of power. She couldn't strategize her way through this meeting. She couldn't leverage anything. She had no offers that would matter, no threats that would land, no position from which to negotiate. She only had accountability, and she wasn't even sure how to present that effectively. She canceled her other meetings. She told her assistant to clear her schedule completely. She didn't consult with her executive team about talking points or legal exposure. This couldn't be a corporate interaction managed by committee. It had to be personal, direct, and honest. The realization that she'd spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability made her understand how thoroughly she'd insulated herself from genuine human connection. The night before the meeting, Evelyn barely slept. She kept replaying scenarios in her mind, trying to anticipate what Malcolm might say, how she should respond, what outcome was even possible at this point. But every mental rehearsal felt artificial, like she was trying to script something that needed to be spontaneous to have any meaning at all. She arrived at the meeting location 30 minutes early. Malcolm had suggested a neutral space, a small conference room in a midtown building that neither of them owned or controlled. No home field advantage. No power dynamics built into the environment. Just a room with a table and chairs, and 2 people who needed to have a conversation that one of them had made necessary and the other had every right to refuse. Malcolm arrived exactly on time. He was dressed professionally, but not formally, projecting the same quiet confidence he'd shown at the demo event. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no laptop, no legal team trailing behind. He simply walked into the room, closed the door, and sat down across from Evelyn. The silence stretched. Evelyn had expected him to start, to set terms, or make demands, or at least establish the framework for the conversation. But Malcolm just sat there, calm and patient, clearly willing to wait as long as necessary for her to speak first. The message was clear. This meeting was happening because she'd requested it. Therefore, it was her responsibility to give it purpose. Evelyn took a breath. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Malcolm nodded slightly, but said nothing. "I asked for this meeting because I owe you an apology. Not a corporate apology crafted by PR teams. A real one." She paused, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "What I did at the demo event was wrong. I refused to shake your hand based on assumptions I made in seconds. Assumptions that had nothing to do with who you actually are and everything to do with biases I've carried without examining them. I dismissed you. I humiliated you. and I did it so automatically that I didn't even recognize what I was doing at the time. Malcolm's expression remained neutral. He was listening, but giving her nothing to work with, no indication of whether her words were landing or falling flat. Evelyn continued, feeling the inadequacy of language to convey what she was trying to express. I've spent the last week learning about you, your career, your investments, your philosophy. And what's become clear is that you weren't at that event to network or seek opportunities. You were already successful beyond what I'd assumed. My refusal wasn't just rude. It revealed something about me that I've been avoiding for a long time. What's that? Malcolm asked quietly. The first words he'd spoken since entering the room. That I've been judging people based on appearance and assumption rather than merit. That I've built a career on what I called instinct but was actually prejudice. That I've wielded power without accountability for too long. Evelyn's voice wavered slightly. I convinced myself I was maintaining standards. But what I was really doing was excluding people who didn't fit a narrow definition of what success looks like. And that definition was based on bias, not business. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Do you know why I came to your event? No. I was considering expanding my investment in your company. Not directly. Through consortium funds that would have provided infrastructure support and regulatory relationships. Your CFO had reached out months ago through intermediaries, presenting Meridian as an organization committed to innovation and inclusion. The pitch was compelling, so I came to see for myself whether the reality matched the marketing. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach, and instead, I showed you exactly the opposite. You showed me that no matter how polished the presentation, no matter how progressive the public messaging, the culture was still defined by someone who makes snap judgments about people's worth based on how they look. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now. Not anger, something deeper. That handshake wasn't just a social courtesy I was seeking. It was a test, and you failed it completely. I know, Evelyn said quietly. And I understand if that failure is permanent. If there's nothing I can say or do that would change your assessment. I'm not here to negotiate or manipulate or try to salvage a business relationship. I'm here because you deserved better than what I gave you. And I needed to say that directly. Why now? Malcolm asked. Why only after consequences forced you to recognize what happened? The question landed like a physical blow because it was completely fair. Evelyn had to swallow before she could answer. You're right. If my company wasn't in crisis, if my position wasn't threatened, I don't know if I would have examined my actions closely enough to understand what they really were. That's shameful, but it's true. At least you're being honest about that. I'm trying to be honest about all of it, even the parts that make me look worse. Evelyn paused. You said the handshake was a test. Can I ask what you were testing for? Basic human decency, Malcolm said simply. The willingness to treat someone with respect before knowing their net worth or influence. It's a low bar. Most people clear it easily. You didn't. The bluntness of it stung precisely because it was accurate. Evelyn had been so focused on protecting her position, maintaining her carefully curated circle, managing optics, that she'd failed the most fundamental test of character. She'd been given a chance to simply be decent to another human being, and she'd chosen exclusion instead. I don't know how to fix this, Evelyn admitted. I can apologize. I can acknowledge what I did. I can commit to doing better. But I can't undo the moment or erase what it revealed about me. No, you can't, Malcolm agreed. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. You want to know the hardest part about what you did? It wasn't just the refusal. It was the confidence behind it. You were so certain you were right to dismiss me that you didn't even hesitate. That kind of certainty, that unexamined conviction that your snap judgments are accurate, that's what makes bias so dangerous. Because it feels like wisdom. You're right, Evelyn said. I've prided myself on reading people quickly, on trusting my instincts. But I never questioned where those instincts came from or what they were actually based on. Malcolm stood, and Evelyn's heart sank, thinking the meeting was over. But he didn't move toward the door. He walked to the window, looking out at the city below. When he spoke, his back was still to her. I've been dismissed more times than I can count. Mistaken for staff at events I was invited to. had my credentials questioned despite being more qualified than most people in the room. Watched opportunities go to less capable people because they fit someone's narrow definition of what expertise looks like. He turned to face her. I built my career learning to navigate those exclusions, and I decided early on that when I gained influence, I would use it to create different systems, not to punish people who'd excluded me, but to simply remove my support from environments that perpetuated those patterns. Is that what you're doing with Meridian? Evelyn asked. Removing support? I'm not doing anything to Meridian, Malcolm said. I'm simply not extending support that was never formally committed. The partnerships that are dissolving would have required my active endorsement to solidify. I'm just choosing not to provide that endorsement. It's not punishment. It's boundary setting. Evelyn understood the distinction, and it made everything worse. Malcolm wasn't sabotaging her company. He was just declining to save it from consequences that existed independent of his actions. The crisis Meridian was facing would have happened eventually if the company's leadership couldn't recognize and address its fundamental problems. Malcolm had simply accelerated the timeline. What would it take? Evelyn asked. Not to restore business relationships. I understand that ship may have sailed. But what would it take for you to believe that change is possible? That I'm capable of learning from this? Malcolm returned to his chair. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor cruel. Just honest. It would take more than words. More than apologies. It would take structural change that makes it impossible for what happened with me to happen to anyone else. It would require you to be willing to surrender some of the unilateral power that enabled your bias in the first place. What kind of structural change? That's for you to figure out, Malcolm said. If I tell you what to do, you're just following instructions. The work has to come from genuine recognition of what needs to change and why. He paused. But I'll tell you this. If you want to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with everyone watching this situation, it won't happen quietly. Real accountability is public. It's uncomfortable, and it requires you to risk the reputation you've spent years cultivating. Evelyn felt the weight of what he was saying. Public accountability meant admitting fault openly, exposing her mistakes to industry-wide scrutiny, accepting consequences without knowing if redemption was even possible. Everything in her wanted to find a quieter path, a way to fix things behind closed doors through private negotiations and strategic repositioning. But that approach, that instinct to manage optics and protect image, was exactly what had created this problem in the first place. If I do that, Evelyn said slowly, if I commit to real structural change and public accountability, there's no guarantee it will matter. No guarantee the board will support me. No guarantee you'll restore business relationships. I could sacrifice everything and still lose my position. Yes, Malcolm said simply. That's what accountability costs. The outcome isn't guaranteed. You just have to decide whether doing the right thing matters regardless of the result. He stood again, and this time it was clear the meeting was ending. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. You asked what it would take for me to believe change is possible. Here's the truth. I don't need to believe in your change. You need to believe in it. Whether I ever work with Meridian again is less important than whether you become someone who wouldn't refuse another person's handshake in the first place. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Evelyn sat alone in the empty conference room, understanding that she'd just been given something more valuable than forgiveness. She'd been given clarity. Malcolm had laid out the path forward with brutal honesty. No false hope. No easy solutions. Just the truth that change was possible, but only if she was willing to pay its full price. And the price was everything. Her pride, her reputation, her position, her carefully constructed image of herself as someone who always knew the right answer, made the right call, trusted the right instincts. All of it had to go, not because Malcolm demanded it, but because real growth required burning away everything false to find what was genuine underneath. Evelyn pulled out her phone and sent a message to Lena Cho. Schedule an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. I need to propose something that they're not going to like. Then she sat in the quiet conference room, looking out at the city that had once felt like her kingdom, and began the hardest work of her life. Not building something new, tearing down what she'd become. The morning after her meeting with Malcolm, Evelyn sat in the conference room, watching board members file in with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. She'd called this emergency meeting without explaining her agenda, which had only heightened the tension. Patricia Winters took her seat at the head of the table, her face carefully neutral in the way that meant she was preparing for something difficult. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Evelyn began. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap where no one could see them trembling. "I've asked you here because I need to propose something that will be uncomfortable, not just for me, but for everyone invested in this company's future." She had their attention. Around the table, executives and board members leaned forward slightly, that universal signal of heightened focus mixed with apprehension. "I met with Malcolm Reed yesterday. He made it clear that restoring business relationships isn't about negotiation or damage control. It's about fundamental change in how this company operates and who leads it." Evelyn paused, forcing herself to continue. He outlined several conditions, not as demands, but as non-negotiables if we want to rebuild trust. An independent leadership audit, temporary suspension of my executive decision authority, full DI governance review with external oversight, and public acknowledgement of what happened, without excuses or spin. The room erupted, not with shouting, but with the kind of controlled chaos that happens when multiple people try to speak simultaneously while maintaining professional decorum. Marcus Webb's voice cut through first. "You're proposing we hand operational control to outside auditors? That's corporate suicide. It's accountability," Evelyn said quietly. "Something I should have embraced weeks ago instead of trying to manage optics." Patricia held up a hand, silencing the room. "Evelyn, I need clarity. Are you proposing these changes, or are you saying they're required?" "Both." Malcolm was clear that real change requires structural reform, not just policy adjustments. "But more than that, I'm proposing them because they're right. What happened at the demo event wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deeper problems in my leadership and this company's culture." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Admitting systemic problems opened the door to legal exposure, shareholder lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny. Every lawyer in the room was mentally calculating risk. Lena spoke carefully. "If we acknowledge pattern bias, even without admitting legal liability, we're inviting investigations that could uncover things we'd rather keep internal." "Good," Evelyn said, and several people looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "If there are things we'd rather keep internal, that's exactly the problem. We've been protecting reputation over addressing reality." "This is professional suicide," someone muttered from the end of the table. "Probably," Evelyn agreed. "But the alternative is moral bankruptcy that eventually becomes actual bankruptcy when everyone with integrity decides they don't want to work with us." Patricia studied Evelyn with an expression that was difficult to read. "You understand what you're proposing? You're asking us to voluntarily initiate a process that will almost certainly result in your removal as CEO." "I'm not asking. I am volunteering." Evelyn took a breath. "I'm stepping down as acting CEO, effective immediately. I'll remain as a non-voting executive advisor during the review period, but operational authority transfers to an interim leader. Daniel Brooks is my recommendation." The room went completely silent. This wasn't a strategic repositioning or a temporary measure with an obvious reversal plan. This was Evelyn Carter removing herself from power with no guarantee she'd ever get it back. "Why?" Patricia asked simply. "Because Malcolm was right. I can't lead the change that needs to happen while simultaneously defending the leadership style that created the problem. Real accountability requires giving up control, not just promising to use it better." The board debated for 3 hours. Half saw it as necessary transparency. The other half saw it as weakness that would destroy shareholder confidence. But eventually, a slim majority agreed to move forward. Not because they believed in redemption or corporate ethics, but because the alternative was watching the company slowly collapse as partnerships dissolved and talent fled. The announcement went out that afternoon. Simple language, no corporate jargon. Evelyn Carter stepping aside during an independent leadership review. Daniel Brooks assuming interim CEO role. Full governance audit beginning immediately. The statement acknowledged that concerns had been raised about exclusionary practices and committed to addressing them transparently. The market reaction was brutal at first. Stock dropped 7% in the first hour of trading. Financial news networks ran segments questioning whether Meridian could survive such public instability. Analysts called it unprecedented, and not as a compliment. But something unexpected happened over the following days. Academic institutions began citing Meridian as a case study in corporate accountability. Leadership consultants referenced it in seminars about organizational reform. A few prominent voices in the business community praised the move as the kind of transparency that boards usually avoided until forced by crisis or litigation. The narrative was shifting, not from catastrophe to triumph, but from scandal to something more complex. A company confronting uncomfortable truths about itself. The internet's reaction was mixed but curious. People were watching to see if the accountability was genuine or just sophisticated reputation management. Malcolm saw the announcement. He was in his office when his assistant mentioned it, pulling up the statement on his screen. He read it twice, his expression unreadable. His team waited for some reaction, approval or skepticism or satisfaction. But Malcolm simply nodded once and returned to the investment report he'd been reviewing. One of his advisors asked, "Are you going to respond?" "No," Malcolm said quietly. "This isn't about me anymore. Either they follow through or they don't. My opinion won't change the outcome." But privately, later that evening, Malcolm did something he rarely allowed himself. He felt a flicker of hope. Not certainty, not trust, just the possibility that maybe, sometimes, people could recognize their worst instincts and choose differently. Meanwhile, Evelyn faced the hardest part. Not the board vote or the public statement, but the private conversations that followed. Daniel called a senior leadership meeting, and this time, Evelyn attended not as the person running it, but as someone present to answer questions and accept responsibility. The meeting was devastating in its honesty. One by one, executives shared stories Evelyn had never heard. A talented analyst passed over for promotion because she didn't fit the culture. A black senior engineer constantly asked to prove credentials that white colleagues took for granted. A junior executive told about client meetings where Evelyn had subtly excluded her from key conversations despite her expertise being directly relevant. Evelyn listened without defending herself, without explaining away the incidents as misunderstandings or alternative perspectives. She just listened. And with each story, she understood more completely how her supposedly excellent instincts had actually been patterns of bias so ingrained she'd mistaken them for professional judgment. When the last person finished speaking, the room was silent. Evelyn looked around at faces that showed pain, anger, exhaustion, and something else she hadn't expected. The faint possibility of hope that maybe things could actually change. "I don't know how to fix all of this," Evelyn said finally. "I can't undo the harm I've caused or the opportunities I've denied people. But I can commit to not defending it anymore, not explaining it away, not pretending it was something other than what it was. And I can work to build systems that make it harder for the next person in my position to repeat my mistakes." Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. Do you really believe you can change? Or is this just damage control that'll fade once the crisis passes? "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "I want to believe I can change. But wanting isn't the same as doing. So I guess the answer is, ask me again in a year. Judge me by actions, not intentions." That night, Evelyn did something she'd never done in her entire career. She wrote a personal statement, unedited by PR teams or reviewed by legal counsel. She recorded herself reading it, just her face on camera, no production value or polish. And she posted it directly to her personal social media accounts. The video was 3 minutes long. She explained what had happened at the demo event, acknowledged the bias behind her actions, and took full responsibility without qualifiers. She didn't name Malcolm, respecting his privacy, but she was specific about her failure and what it revealed about her leadership. "I refuse to shake someone's hand because I made assumptions about their worth based on appearance. I dismissed a person I should have respected because they didn't match my narrow definition of who belongs in elite spaces. I did this automatically, without thought, which means the bias was so deep I didn't even recognize it. That's not just a mistake. It's a fundamental failure of character and leadership. The internet's response was characteristically mixed. Some people saw genuine accountability. Others saw calculated reputation management. Many simply watched, waiting to see what came next, whether the words would translate into actual change or fade into the usual cycle of corporate apologies that meant nothing. But one person who saw was Malcolm Reed. He watched the video alone in his apartment, and for the first time since the handshake incident, his expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not approval, just acknowledgement that Evelyn had taken the first real step. Whether she'd take the next 1,000 steps, that actual change required remained to be seen. 3 weeks after Evelyn's public statement, the independent audit began. The team consisted of external investigators with backgrounds in organizational psychology, corporate ethics, and DEI consulting. They were given complete access to internal communications, HR records, employee feedback surveys, and permission to conduct confidential interviews with anyone in the company. What they uncovered wasn't dramatic. No illegal discrimination. No documented hate speech. Just years of subtle, systemic patterns. Hiring practices that favored candidates from certain schools and networks. Promotion decisions influenced by subjective assessments of cultural fit. Feedback systems that penalized employees for being too direct while rewarding others for the same behavior. 1,000 small choices that collectively created an environment where some people had to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. The preliminary findings were shared with the board first, then with senior leadership, and finally with the entire company. The full report would be made public in 6 weeks, per the commitment to transparency. Reading through the findings, Evelyn felt physically ill, not because anything was surprising, but because seeing it documented in stark clinical language made it impossible to ignore or minimize. But then something unexpected happened. Someone on the executive team, a VP who had benefited from the systems being criticized, leaked partial audit findings to a business journalist. The leak was clearly designed to make things look worse than they were, taking quotes out of context and framing the investigation as proof that Meridian was irredeemably toxic rather than undertaking necessary reform. The article went live on a major business news site. The headline screamed about corporate culture in crisis. Social media exploded with hot takes. Competitors circled, sensing blood in the water. Several clients put contracts under review. 2 senior engineers resigned, citing the negative publicity and uncertainty about the company's future. Rachel Moore burst into Daniel's office, her face pale. "This is a disaster. The leak has completely changed the narrative. We went from accountability to chaos." Daniel looked exhausted. He'd been working 18-hour days, trying to stabilize operations while managing the audit process. "Can we identify who leaked it?" "IT is working on it. But even if we find them, the damage is done." What happened next surprised everyone. Malcolm Reed issued a public statement, not to defend Meridian or Evelyn, but to condemn the leak. The statement was brief and pointed. Whoever leaked partial audit findings to undermine Meridian's reform process has revealed more about their own character than about the company's problems. Accountability requires integrity throughout. Cherry-picking embarrassing details while ignoring context isn't journalism or justice. It's sabotage disguised as transparency. Organizations attempting genuine change deserve the space to do that work honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. The statement didn't mention Evelyn or express support for her leadership, but it defended the process of reform itself, and coming from Malcolm, it carried weight. Other voices in the business community began echoing his perspective. The narrative shifted again, this time toward a more nuanced discussion about the difference between accountability and public shaming, between transparency and exploitation. The leak was eventually traced to Marcus Webb, the CTO who had been one of Evelyn's closest allies. His motivation became clear through internal communications that IT recovered. He'd been positioning himself as her replacement, using the crisis to advance his own ambitions. The board removed him immediately, and his departure sent a clear message that gaming the reform process wouldn't be tolerated. But the damage to public perception lingered. Media coverage intensified. Business schools added Meridian to case study curricula, analyzing the situation from every angle. Some professors used it to teach about unconscious bias and corporate responsibility. Others used it as a cautionary tale about the risks of public accountability. Universities weren't the only ones watching. Employees throughout the company were measuring every decision against stated values. Junior staff who had previously kept concerns quiet began speaking up in town halls and feedback sessions. Some of what they shared was painful. Stories of feeling invisible, of being passed over, of watching less qualified people advance while they hit invisible ceilings. During one particularly difficult town hall, a young black engineer named Marcus Thompson stood up and addressed the room. His voice shook slightly, but his words were clear. I've worked here for 4 years. In that time, I've watched 3 white engineers with less experience get promoted ahead of me. When I asked about advancement, I was told I needed to demonstrate more leadership presence, which apparently means being more like people who don't look like me. I stayed because I believed in the work. But I'm tired of believing that if I just work harder or fit better, things will change. So my question is simple. Are we actually fixing the systems that created these patterns, or are we just apologizing for them? The room went silent. Daniel looked at Evelyn, silently asking if she wanted to respond. She nodded and stood up, moving to where everyone could see her. You're right to be skeptical, Evelyn said. Apologies are easy. Changing systems is hard. And I don't have a perfect answer about whether we're doing enough or moving fast enough. What I can tell you is that we're designing governance structures that limit unilateral executive power, including mine if I ever return to leadership. We're implementing blind review processes for promotions. We're creating accountability metrics that get measured and reported publicly. But you shouldn't trust promises. Watch what we actually do. Marcus Thompson considered this, then asked the question that mattered most. What happens if you come back as CEO and the crisis passes? What stops you from sliding back into old patterns once the pressure is off? Nothing stops me except the systems we build and the people willing to call out problems when they see them, Evelyn answered honestly. That's why structural change matters more than personal transformation. You shouldn't have to rely on me being a better person. You should be able to rely on systems that work regardless of who's in charge. The conversation continued for another hour. Not everyone was satisfied with the answers. Some people remained deeply skeptical, but something shifted in the room. Not trust, exactly, but the possibility of trust if words translated into sustained action. That evening, Malcolm agreed to a second private meeting with Evelyn. This time, it was at his suggestion. They met in the same neutral conference room where they'd had their first real conversation. But the dynamic was different now. Less adversarial. More like 2 people trying to solve a complex problem rather than opponents facing off. I saw your response at the town hall, Malcolm said. That was good. Honest without being defensive. I'm learning, Evelyn replied. Slowly. Painfully, but learning. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something personal. You asked me once how I built my career navigating exclusion. I want to tell you something I don't usually discuss publicly. Evelyn listened, sensing this was important. When I was 26, I was invited to present at a major investment conference. I've been working on a thesis about emerging markets that was getting attention. I showed up early, dressed professionally, prepared thoroughly. But when I walked into the conference center, security stopped me. They assumed I was service staff. I explained who I was, showed my invitation, but they didn't believe me. They actually escorted me out of the building. What happened? Evelyn asked quietly. The conference organizer saw it happen. She was mortified, apologized profusely, personally walked me back in. But the damage was done. Not just to that day, but to something in me. I had to decide whether to let that experience make me bitter or use it to understand systems that create those assumptions. Which did you choose? Both, initially. I was angry for a long time. But eventually, I realized anger without purpose just burns you from the inside. So I channeled it into building influence that I could use to create different systems. Not to punish people who'd excluded me, but to support environments that valued people based on what they contributed rather than how they looked. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. That's why your handshake refusal hit harder than you probably understood. It wasn't just one incident. It was every incident I'd experienced, multiplied by every person who's faced similar dismissals. And you did it with such casual certainty that it was clear you'd never questioned whether your instincts might be wrong. I'm questioning them now, Evelyn said. Every day, every decision. It's exhausting, but I'm starting to understand that's what growth requires. Constant examination of assumptions I used to take for granted. That's good, Malcolm said. But here's what I need you to understand. Personal growth isn't enough. You asked what it would take for me to believe change is possible. The answer is structural reform that outlasts your leadership. Systems that prevent the next CEO from making the same mistakes, even if they want to. We're working on that, Evelyn said. Governance models that distribute power. Independent oversight with real authority. Metrics that get measured and reported publicly. But I'll be honest, I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything can fully prevent bias from creeping back and once attention shifts elsewhere. You're right, Malcolm agreed. There's no perfect system, but there are better systems. And the work of building them has to be continuous, not just a crisis response that fades when the pressure eases. They talked for another hour, not about business relationships or investment decisions, but about the deeper challenge of creating organizational change that actually lasted. Malcolm shared insights from companies he'd worked with that had successfully reformed their cultures. Evelyn asked questions, took notes, and, for the first time in weeks, felt like she was contributing something useful rather than just accepting consequences. As the meeting ended, Malcolm made something clear. I'm not going to reactivate business relationships with Meridian yet. You're doing important work, but it's too early to know if it'll stick. But I'm not actively opposing you either. That's not forgiveness. It's just acknowledgement that the path you're on is the right one, even if you haven't walked far enough down it yet. That's fair, Evelyn said. More than fair, actually. Malcolm paused at the door. The board vote is coming up soon, whether you return as CEO or not. Have you thought about what you'll do if they vote no? Try to be useful in whatever capacity makes sense, Evelyn answered. Maybe teach. Maybe consult. Maybe just take time to figure out who I am when I'm not defining myself by a title. Good answer, Malcolm said. And for the first time since the handshake incident, he smiled slightly. Not warmth exactly, but something less cold than before. Recognition that growth was happening, even if the destination remained uncertain. After he left, Evelyn sat alone in the conference room once again. But this time, the solitude felt different. Not isolating, but clarifying. She was beginning to understand that redemption wasn't about returning to where she'd been before. It was about becoming someone different, someone better, someone who'd earned the right to lead not through strategic brilliance or ruthless efficiency, but through the harder work of genuine accountability and sustained change. The board vote was 3 days away. The world was watching, and Evelyn was finally ready to accept whatever came next, knowing that her worth as a person had to be separate from her value as a CEO. The lesson was hard, but necessary, and long overdue. 3 days passed with the weight of inevitability. The board vote approached like a storm everyone could see coming, but no one could avoid. Evelyn spent those days in a strange state of acceptance. She'd done everything she could, proposed structural changes, stepped aside from power, faced uncomfortable truths publicly. Now the decision belonged to others, and she'd learned enough to understand that was exactly how it should be. The boardroom felt different on the morning of the vote. The usual power dynamics had shifted so completely that Evelyn wasn't even sure where to sit. Patricia Winters gestured to a chair along the side wall, not at the main table. A subtle but unmistakable signal. Evelyn was present, but not as a decision-maker. Not anymore. Daniel Brooks sat at the table, looking uncomfortable with the attention. He'd been interim CEO for 3 weeks, and by all accounts, he'd done well. Operations had stabilized. The audit was proceeding on schedule. Employee morale, while still fragile, showed signs of improvement. But everyone knew this vote wasn't really about operational performance. It was about what kind of leadership Meridian wanted to be known for going forward. Patricia called the meeting to order. We're here to vote on whether Evelyn Carter returns to her position as CEO or whether we make Daniel Brooks' interim role permanent. Before we vote, does anyone have final comments? Board member Thomas Richardson spoke first. He was in his 60s, a traditionalist who'd made his fortune in manufacturing. I think we're making a mistake treating this like a moral referendum. Evelyn built this company. She made one error in judgment that got blown out of proportion. We should restore her, implement some policy changes, and move forward. The market wants stability, not symbolism. It wasn't one error, Lena, Cho said quietly from her seat at the table. The audit documented patterns going back years. Hiring bias, promotion iniquity, systematic exclusion that we've ignored because it wasn't illegal and because it was inconvenient to address. Which is why we're implementing reforms, Thomas countered. But throwing away proven leadership because of changing cultural standards seems reactionary. Cultural standards, or basic human decency? Daniel asked, his voice level but firm. I've read every page of that audit. The patterns weren't subtle. We just chose not to see them because acknowledging them would require difficult changes. The debate continued for 40 minutes. Some board members argued for Evelyn's return, citing her strategic vision and industry relationships. Others advocated for new leadership, believing the company needed a clean break from its past. A few occupied the uncomfortable middle ground, recognizing both Evelyn's value and the genuine harm her leadership style had caused. Finally, Patricia called for the vote. All in favor of Evelyn Carter returning as CEO, indicate now. 5 hands went up. Evelyn counted them, keeping her expression neutral. All opposed. 5 more hands. The room went completely silent. A tied vote. Everyone had known this was possible, but the reality of it still carried shock. Meridian Technologies hung in perfect balance, half wanting to move forward with familiar leadership, half believing change required different faces in positions of power. Patricia's voice cut through the silence. We have a tie. As you know, Malcolm Reed holds a proxy seat through his consortium investment structure. He doesn't typically vote on internal matters, but the bylaws are clear. In the event of a tie on leadership decisions, all board seats, including proxies, must be counted. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The deciding vote belonged to Malcolm, the man whose hand she'd refused to shake, the person she dismissed and humiliated. Now he would determine whether she ever led Meridian again. Patricia had already arranged for Malcolm to call in. The conference line activated, and his voice came through the speakers, calm and measured as always. I've been briefed on a vote. Before I cast my decision, I want to be clear about my reasoning. This isn't about punishment or forgiveness. It's about what's best for Meridian's future. The room waited. Evelyn found herself holding her breath. I vote no, Malcolm said simply. Evelyn Carter should not return as CEO. The shock rippled through the boardroom. Several people had expected him to vote yes, to demonstrate the kind of grace that would make him look magnanimous. Others had expected vindictive no, satisfying justice. But Malcolm's tone suggested neither generosity nor vengeance. Just a decision made with clear reasoning. Would you explain your reasoning? Patricia asked. Evelyn has done important work over the past month. Malcolm continued. She's taken accountability, stepped aside from power, and initiated necessary reforms. That growth matters and should be recognized. But redemption and restoration aren't the same thing. She can become a better person, learn from her mistakes, and contribute meaningfully to corporate leadership. That doesn't mean she should return to the exact position where those patterns developed. He paused, letting his words settle. Leadership isn't just about competence or strategy. It's about trust. Evelyn violated that trust through years of biased decision-making that she didn't recognize or question. Rebuilding trust takes time, more time than a few weeks, and it doesn't require putting her back in the same role where the problems originated. So you're punishing her, Thomas Richardson said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. No, Malcolm replied firmly. I'm making a decision about organizational health. Evelyn can contribute to leadership and corporate ethics in other ways. Teaching, consulting, speaking about what she learned. But Meridian needs leadership that employees can trust without reservation. Right now, too many people in that company are waiting to see if the changes stick or fade once the crisis passes. Keeping Daniel as CEO sends a clear message that this isn't temporary damage control. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Malcolm added something unexpected. For what it's worth, I believe Evelyn has changed. I believe her accountability is genuine. But believing in someone's personal growth doesn't obligate me to restore their professional position. Those are separate questions. After Malcolm disconnected, the room remained silent for a long time. Patricia looked at Evelyn, concern evident in her expression. Do you want to respond? Evelyn stood slowly. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She could feel the weight of expectation, the assumption that she might argue or plead her case. But looking around at faces that had once deferred to her without question, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. Malcolm is right, she said quietly. I've spent the past month learning to separate who I am from what I do. My identity shouldn't be dependent on a job title. And frankly, Meridian deserves leadership that employees don't have to question or monitor constantly. Daniel has earned their trust. I haven't. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the context of this company. She turned to Daniel. You should be CEO, not interim, not as a placeholder. You've earned it through years of integrity and these past weeks of solid leadership. The company is in good hands. Thomas Richardson looked like he wanted to argue, but Patricia moved quickly to consolidate the decision. Then it's settled. Daniel Brooks is confirmed as CEO. Evelyn, we'd like you to remain as a senior advisor if you're willing. No operational authority, but your strategic insight still has value. I appreciate that, Evelyn said, but I think my value lies elsewhere now. I like to step away from Meridian completely, not in anger or disappointment, but because I need to figure out who I am when I'm not hiding behind corporate power. The meeting concluded with logistics and transition planning. Formal announcements would go out that afternoon. Daniel would address employees the next morning. Evelyn would have 2 weeks to close out her remaining responsibilities, and then, for the first time in her adult life, she'd be without the title that had defined her for so long. As people filed out, Patricia pulled Evelyn aside. You handled that with grace. I know it couldn't have been easy. It was easier than I expected, Evelyn admitted. Somewhere in the past month, I stopped fighting for the CEO position and started fighting to become someone worthy of respect, title or not. Losing the vote doesn't change that work. What will you do? Evelyn smiled slightly. Honestly, I have no idea, and that's terrifying in a way that feels necessary. The announcement hit the business world that afternoon. Media reaction was predictably intense. Some outlets framed it as a cautionary tale about cancel culture and overcorrection. Others praised it as accountability in action. Most fell somewhere in between, acknowledging the complexity of balancing justice with practicality. But the most interesting reactions came from unexpected places. Young executives across industries shared the story as an example of what accountability could look like. Business school professors used it to discuss the difference between personal and professional redemption. Even people critical of how it unfolded agreed that it represented something rare in corporate America. Consequences that matched the severity of systemic failures. Malcolm read the coverage from his office. When his team asked if he wanted to make a statement, he declined. This isn't about me, he said simply. It's about whether organizations can actually change. My part in that story is finished. But privately, Malcolm felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that maybe the handshake refusal, as painful as it had been, had created an opportunity for change that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Sometimes the worst moments force conversations that politeness would have avoided forever. Meanwhile, Evelyn began the strange process of dismantling a life built entirely around corporate achievement. She cleaned out her office over several days, each box of files and awards and photos representing a version of herself she was leaving behind. Not with bitterness, but with the understanding that growth sometimes required complete transformation. On her last day at Meridian, employees who'd been afraid of her months ago now approached with something different in their eyes. Not fear, not even pity, something closer to respect for someone who'd faced their worst self and chosen to change rather than defend. A junior analyst stopped her in the hallway. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for what you did before, but for what you did after. For not pretending it didn't matter or wasn't real." Evelyn felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. "I should have done it sooner, before people got hurt by my blindness." "Maybe," the analyst said, "but you did eventually. That still matters." 6 months after leaving Meridian, Evelyn published an essay, not in a business journal or as a LinkedIn post, but in a literary magazine that focused on personal transformation. The piece was titled "The Hand I Didn't Take," and it dissected her failure with unflinching honesty. She didn't position herself as redeemed or reformed. She positioned herself as someone still learning, still examining biases, still working to become better than she'd been. The essay went somewhat viral in professional circles. Universities requested permission to use it in leadership curricula. Organizations focused on diversity and inclusion reached out about speaking engagements. Evelyn accepted some offers and declined others, learning to be selective about where her story could be useful versus where it might become performative. She started teaching a course at a business school, not about strategy or operations, but about ethical leadership and the danger of unchecked power. Her students were sometimes shocked by her bluntness about her own failures. She didn't sugarcoat or reframe. She just told the truth and let them draw their own conclusions. Malcolm heard about the essay and the teaching. He didn't reach out, but he mentioned it to his team during a discussion about investment criteria. That's what genuine accountability looks like. Not defending, not moving on quickly, actually staying in the discomfort long enough to change. 5 years passed. The kind of time that separates crisis from consequence, promise from proof. Meridian Technologies had not just survived its reckoning, but had genuinely transformed. Under Daniel Brooks' leadership, the company had become known for something beyond its technology. It was known for integrity. The governance reforms implemented during the crisis had stuck. Independent oversight wasn't a temporary fix, but a permanent structure. The board included diverse voices with real power, not just tokenism. Promotion processes underwent blind reviews with documented reasoning. Employee satisfaction surveys showed consistent improvement, particularly among groups that had previously felt marginalized. The company was thriving in ways that surprised industry analysts. Profits were solid, but not explosive. Growth was steady, but not aggressive. Meridian had become the kind of organization that people wanted to work for because they trusted its values, not just its vision. That trust translated into retention, innovation, and a reputation that opened doors other companies couldn't access. Daniel had proven himself not just capable, but visionary in his own right. He led with a collaborative style that encouraged dissent and valued diverse perspectives. When problems arose, he addressed them directly rather than managing optics. The culture he'd built was decidedly unglamorous. No breathless media profiles or keynote stages at major conferences. Just solid work, ethical decision-making, and consistent accountability. Malcolm Reed had quietly withdrawn from high-profile investing. Not retirement exactly, but a deliberate shift toward mentorship and systemic reform. He spent his time working with younger investors, teaching them not just about markets and returns, but about building influence with integrity. He funded initiatives focused on expanding access to capital for underrepresented founders. He consulted with organizations trying to reform bias systems. People who knew him well said he seemed more at peace than he'd been during his years of active deal-making. The handshake incident had become part of his story, something he occasionally referenced when discussing the economics of dignity and respect. But it no longer defined him. It was just one moment in a long career dedicated to creating space for people who'd been excluded. Evelyn had found her place in a world that looked nothing like her previous life. She taught 2 courses per semester at different universities. She consulted with companies undergoing leadership transitions, specifically helping executives recognize and address their own biases. She wrote occasionally, always with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized her first essay. She lived more simply than before. A smaller apartment, fewer possessions, more time spent reading, thinking, walking through the city she'd once viewed only through car windows and corner office glass. The loss of power and prestige had been devastating initially, but somewhere in the past 5 years, it had transformed into liberation. People who met her now, who didn't know her history, often remarked on her thoughtfulness. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions instead of making pronouncements. The certainty that had once defined her leadership style had been replaced by intellectual humility. Not weakness, just a recognition that her perspective was limited and learning required ongoing effort. One spring morning, Evelyn received an invitation to speak at a leadership forum. She almost declined. These events often felt performative, platforms for executives to polish their images rather than genuinely engage with difficult questions. But the topic caught her attention: power, accountability, and organizational change. 5 years later, she accepted, not realizing until she arrived at the venue that Malcolm Reed was also speaking. They were on different panels, addressing different aspects of leadership and reform. But during a break between sessions, they found themselves in the same hallway, the first time they'd been in the same physical space since their last private meeting 5 years ago. For a moment, neither spoke. The history between them hung in the air, not hostile, but heavy with meaning. Then Evelyn did something she'd practiced in her mind countless times, but never had the opportunity to do. She extended her hand. Malcolm looked at it, just for a second, a pause that echoed the moment at the demo event, but carried completely different weight. Not dismissal, just consideration. Recognition that this gesture meant something beyond professional courtesy. Then he shook her hand. Firm, brief, professional, but genuine. "It's good to see you," Evelyn said quietly. "You too," Malcolm replied, and she could tell he meant it. They stepped aside from the hallway traffic, finding a quiet corner near a window overlooking the city. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic or cathartic. They didn't rehash the past or exchange profound insights. They just talked about their work, about what they'd learned, about the challenges of creating lasting change in systems designed to resist it. "I read your essay," Malcolm said, "the one about the handshake. It was honest. I try to be. Seemed like the only way to make it useful rather than self-serving. It worked. I recommended it to people struggling with similar issues. Not just about race, but about any situation where power creates blindness." Evelyn nodded. "What you're doing with young investors, the mentorship program. I've heard about it. That's important work." "I hope so. It's slower than I'd like. But sustainable change usually is." They were quiet for a moment, watching the city below. Then Malcolm said something that surprised her. "I don't regret what happened. The handshake, the aftermath, any of it. I wish the lesson could have been learned differently, but I don't regret the outcome." "Neither do I," Evelyn admitted. "I lost everything I thought defined me. And somewhere in that loss, I found something more valuable. Not happiness exactly, but authenticity, purpose that doesn't depend on titles or external validation." "That's good," Malcolm said. "Really good." A forum coordinator approached, indicating they both needed to return to their respective panels. As they parted, Malcolm paused. "Maybe we could have coffee sometime. Not to discuss business or partnerships, just to talk. I think we've both learned enough that the conversation might actually be interesting." "I'd like that," Evelyn said, and meant it. Neither of them noticed the person filming from across the hallway. A quick video, just a few seconds, showing Malcolm and Evelyn shaking hands and talking like colleagues who respected each other. The person who captured it almost posted it to social media, thinking it would get attention, validation for people who'd followed the story years ago. But then they deleted it, because some moments didn't need to be public. Some growth didn't require an audience. The handshake that hadn't happened 5 years ago had taught a lesson that transformed lives and organizations. This handshake, quiet and unremarkable, needed nothing beyond the two people experiencing it. Later that day, both Malcolm and Evelyn gave their presentations. Their topics were different, their approaches distinct, but the underlying message was similar. Power reveals who we are. Accountability shapes who we become. And real change, lasting change, requires letting go of the need to control outcomes and embracing the discomfort of genuine transformation. The audiences responded thoughtfully. Some understood immediately. Others would need time to process. A few would dismiss the message as impractical idealism. But seeds were planted. Conversation started. The work continued. That evening, Evelyn returned to her apartment and did something she hadn't done in years. She opened a journal and wrote. Not for publication or professional development. Just for herself. Processing the day. The unexpected encounter. The handshake that had come 5 years and a complete life transformation after the one that should have happened but didn't. She wrote about regret without shame. Growth without pretending the past didn't matter. Accountability that had cost everything and given back something better. Not redemption in the Hollywood sense, where mistakes get erased by grand gestures, but redemption as a daily practice. Showing up, doing better, staying uncomfortable enough to keep learning. The last line she wrote captured something she'd learned through the hardest years of her life. She refused his hand once. It cost her everything, and gave her something better. Across the city, Malcolm sat in his study, looking at the skyline that had witnessed so much of this story. He thought about the scared young man who'd been escorted out of a conference, the determined professional who'd built influence through integrity, the person who'd had to decide whether the handshake refusal merited response or just required boundaries. He thought about Evelyn's transformation, genuine and earned through years of difficult work. He thought about Meridian's evolution from crisis to exemplar. He thought about the countless conversations that had rippled out from one 12-second moment, changing how people thought about bias, accountability, and organizational culture. And he thought about the handshake today. Simple, professional. Two people who'd both changed, recognizing that change in each other. Not forgiveness, because that implied something owed. Not reconciliation, because there was no relationship to restore. Just mutual respect, earned differently but valued equally. The world would keep watching. Stories like theirs would continue being told, analyzed, debated. Some would see heroes and villains. Others would see complexity and nuance. Most would project their own experiences onto the narrative, finding whatever lessons they needed to find. But for Malcolm and Evelyn, the story had reached a quieter conclusion. Not an ending exactly, just a place where the frantic energy of crisis had settled into the steady work of living with integrity, where the lessons learned in darkness informed choices made in light, where the hand that wasn't taken became a catalyst for transformation that reached far beyond that single moment. The city hummed with its endless motion. Lives changed and evolved. Power shifted. Lessons were learned and forgotten and learned again. And somewhere in all that complexity, two people who'd once been on opposite sides of a profound failure had both become better versions of themselves. Not through forgetting what happened, but through refusing to let it define their worst selves instead of calling them toward their best. The handshake had happened. Finally, quietly, meaningfully, and the world moved forward just slightly better than it had been before. When power makes you forget basic human decency, how much are you willing to lose to remember it again? If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives about accountability, transformation, and the choices that define us.